Welcome to Founding Chronicles. If you enjoy stories from America's haunting past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a journey into history's forgotten corners. Now, let us step back to Natchez, Mississippi. In the 1840s, or behind the grand plantation houses and rolling cotton fields, a horror unfolded that would shake an entire community. This is the story of the slave woman who poisoned her master's entire family. Natchez, Mississippi, in the 1840s was not a quiet place. It was a world where the cotton kingdom had grown into a vast empire, its riches stained by the sweat and blood of enslaved men and women. The town was filled with proud planters in polished boots and high collars, their wives in bright silks, their children running across wide porches. Beneath that wealth was a silence few dared to break, the silence of those in chains. It was a silence that carried through the fields, the kitchens, and the quarters. But one woman, unknown at first, would break it in a way so terrible that Natchez would whisper her name for years. The story begins at one of the grand homes just outside the town. A wide plantation house, its white columns tall against the southern sky, stood as a symbol of wealth and power. Inside lived a family that owned many acres, many slaves, and believed themselves untouchable. The master was a stern man, proud of his crops and his place among the wealthy planters. His wife was softer in manner, but strict in rule. Their children lived in comfort, cared for by enslaved women who brushed their hair, carried them food, and hushed them to sleep. Among the servants was a woman who kept mostly to herself. She worked quietly, her hands always busy, her face rarely lifting toward the people who commanded her. No one looked at her closely. To the family, she was just another one of the many enslaved women in their house, moving like a shadow between the kitchen and the table. Her name has been lost in some tellings, changed in others, but in the records of that time she appears as a woman burdened with silence and carrying a kind of anger that could not be spoken aloud. Life for her had never known freedom. She had been born into bondage, like so many others, or perhaps sold down the river from another state. Natchez was full of such stories. In that era, Natchez was one of the busiest slave markets in the South. Men, women, and children were brought there in chains, sold beneath the sun, while buyers bargained as if over cattle. A woman in our story had lived through such cruelties. She had been beaten, she had been used, she had watched people she loved taken from her. These wounds did not fade. They burned beneath her quiet movements. In the evenings, when the family gathered at their long dining table, she served them their meals. Silver glimmered in the candlelight, voices rang in laughter, and the master raised his glass of wine, speaking of harvests and profits. The woman poured and served, and she listened. Every word, every command pressed against her, heart like a stone. And yet none suspected that in her silence a storm was building. Slavery was designed to crush the spirit, to strip a person of choice. But sometimes choice came in dangerous hidden forms. For this woman, the kitchen became her battlefield. She learned the herbs, the powders, the strange roots that could heal or harm. Old knowledge passed down among the enslaved, whispered in secret, shared by those who remembered traditions from Africa or from generations of survival in bondage. She knew which plants made the stomach turn, which seeds burned the throat, which mixtures could bring a man to his knees. For weeks, perhaps months, no one noticed the changes. A master coughing after supper, a child's stomach cramping through the night, the mistress pale in the morning, her appetite gone. At first, these were dismissed as passing illness. The Mississippi climate often brought fever. Food spoiled. In the heat, doctors came and went, shaking their heads, prescribing tonics that did little. The family trusted their house servants, never questioning the hands that prepared their meals. But the sickness did not pass. It grew. One by one, the family began to falter. The master grew weak, his temper shorter. The mistress could hardly rise from her bed. Even the children, once lively and bright, lay still, their eyes glassy. Neighbors started to whisper. Could it be fever? Could it be some new plague? But whispers turned darker when people noticed who was always present, who carried the food, who poured the wine. The enslaved woman remained calm, outwardly dutiful, but within her there was no fear. She had chosen a path from which there was no return. To some, her act was madness. To others, it was a cry of vengeance, a rebellion hidden in the very heart of the master's home. The slow death that spread through the family's veins was not accident. It was her doing. Natchez was a place of rumor, and in the 1840s, nothing spread faster than fear. When word leaked that the sickness inside that fine plantation house might not be natural, the town shuddered. For planters, it was their deepest dread. Slavery depended on control, on obedience, on the belief that the enslaved would never dare to strike back. But here was proof that even in silence, revenge could rise. If one woman could bring down an entire family with nothing more than what grew in the earth, what might others do? The discovery came late, when the family was already broken. The master lay dying, his wife fading beside him, his children gasping for breath. Desperation led someone, perhaps a neighbor, perhaps one of the surviving house servants, to point toward the woman in the kitchen. They searched her quarters. They found small bundles of herbs, powders hidden away, signs that could not be ignored. Fear became fury. The law in Natchez, like across the South, was not written for justice when it came to slaves. It was written for punishment, for control, for warning. The woman was seized, dragged from the quarters, and accused of poisoning. There was no trial as we understand it. There was accusation, and that was enough. She was forced to stand before men who saw her not as human, but as property gone dangerous. The verdict was already known before the words were spoken. Crowds gathered. The story of a slave woman poisoning her master's entire family struck terror in every white household. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Planters sharpened their rules, their discipline, their punishments. They said this could not be allowed to happen again. They said fear must be answered with fear. The woman stood in silence. Her fate was certain. Yet in that silence was also her final defiance. She had done what no one thought possible. She had struck at the very heart of power. She had reminded Natchez that even the oppressed could still wield a terrible strength. And though her punishment would be swift and brutal, her act left a shadow that lingered in the cotton fields and along the great river. That was how the horror of Natchez in the 1840s began, the story of the slave woman who poisoned her masters. Entire family shaking the empire of slavery with one hidden hand. The woman's arrest shook Natchez to its core. The town, already built on fear and suspicion, now lived in a state of constant dread. For the white families who held power, it was as if the walls of their world had cracked. Slavery was not only their wealth, their livelihood, but their protection. At least they thought so. They believed that if they kept tight control, if they punished swiftly, if they demanded obedience, their position could never be challenged. Yet now, standing in front of them was living proof that control was never as firm as they claimed. Plantation House, where the sickness had struck, became a place of quiet horror. Neighbors walked the halls with hushed voices, seeing the master weak in bed, his wife pale and gaunt, the children barely able to lift their heads. The rooms that once rang with music and laughter now smelled of sickness and fear. Doctors still came, offering bitter tonics, whispering prayers, but they could not undo what had already been done. Every glance in the household turned toward the enslaved people who remained. Every plate of food was eyed with suspicion. Every sip of water was swallowed slowly, fear pressing in with every taste. The enslaved woman at the center of it all was kept under guard. Some said she was calm. Others swore she smiled in the face of her captors. Though history has a way of twisting the expressions of the powerless to fit the stories of the powerful. Whether she held her head high or looked at the ground, one truth was clear. She did not confess. Not in the way they demanded. To her, no confession was needed. Her act spoke for itself. Her silence was its own kind of voice. For the community, however, silence was unbearable. They needed a story to tell themselves, a reason to believe this. Horror was not simply the beginning of something greater. They whispered to one another about poison hidden in the bread. Herbs slipped into the stew, powders stirred into coffee. They told their children that this was why they must never trust the hands that served them. Men at the taverns in town muttered darkly that if one slave woman could do such a thing, then perhaps others were planning the same. Suspicion spread like a fever, hotter than the Mississippi sun. The laws of Mississippi offered no mercy. To them, she was not a woman but a danger, not a human being but a warning. The punishment for poisoning, or even the suspicion of poisoning, was death, swift and brutal. Sometimes it was the rope, sometimes the fire, sometimes worse. What mattered most was not justice, but example. The white families of Natchez wanted every enslaved man and woman to see what would happen if they dared to rebel, even in secret, even in silence. So the town prepared itself for a spectacle. But before that day came, there was the waiting. In the quarters where the enslaved lived, fear ran deep. The other women and men who had worked beside her now felt the heat of suspicion on their backs. Some may have pitied her, some may have admired her courage, but none dared to speak openly. To be linked to her in any way could mean death. And yet, behind closed doors, when the night was dark and the risk was lowest, there were whispers among them too. Whispers that she had struck a blow no one else had dared. Whispers that perhaps she was not only guilty, but brave. That maybe she had given voice to what so many felt, but could never say aloud. Children heard the adults murmur in the night, their young minds trying to understand. Why would someone risk such a terrible fate? Why would someone bring death to the very house they lived in? To those children, still too small to know the depth of slavery's cruelty, the answers did not come easily. But to the grown men and women who had been whipped, who had been sold, who had been torn from their loved ones, the answer was clear. Hatred brewed in silence. Despair sharpened into resolve. Sometimes even death itself seemed lighter than the weight of chains. Meanwhile, the white families of Natchez gathered in parlors and on wide verandas, fanning themselves in the heat, speaking in voices low but urgent. They had always feared rebellion. Only a few years before, in other parts of the South, rumors of uprisings had left entire towns trembling. They knew the story of Nat Turner in Virginia, of slaves who rose in the night and killed their masters. They knew the stories of poisonings. In other places, sometimes whispered, sometimes written in the papers. They told themselves that Natchez would never face such terror. Now they were not so sure. Every creak of the floorboards, every hushed conversation among the enslaved was seen as a possible plot. The trust that once allowed them to sleep through the night was gone. Guns were kept closer at hand. Patrols grew stricter. Punishments became harsher, as if by sheer cruelty they could beat back the shadow of fear. The woman remained locked away, her fate sealed, though the exact day of her punishment had not yet been fixed. Some said she prayed. Some said she did not utter a word. A few claimed she sang low to herself, old songs that no one else could understand. Perhaps these were stories born of imagination. Tales the townsfolk told to paint her as strange or devilish. Or perhaps they were true, perhaps she found comfort in her own way. Even as death closed in around her dot, when word spread that she would be executed, the town stirred with grim excitement. For many white families, this was not only about justice, it was about reasserting control. They needed to see her punished, needed to show their children and their slaves that rebellion brought nothing but destruction. The day was chosen, and word traveled quickly. People would come from miles around to see it. It would be a warning written not on paper, but on flesh. The enslaved people knew what was coming too. Some wept quietly, others hardened their faces. But all felt the weight of what was about to happen. They had seen such punishments before. They knew how cruel the spectacle could be. Some could not bear to watch. Others were forced to stand in line and look. The masters wanted them to see, wanted to burn the image into their minds. It was not enough to punish the guilty. The punishment had to spread like a shadow over every man, woman, and child in chains. And yet, even as they braced themselves for what was to come, many could not help but feel a flicker of something else. Pride, defiance. In the depths of their suffering, the woman's act was a reminder that even the enslaved could fight back, however terrible the price. On the morning of the execution, Natchez stirred with grim energy. Wagons rolled down dusty roads. Families in fine clothes came to town, their children at their sides. The enslaved were marched from the plantations to stand and witness. The square filled with bodies, voices murmuring in anticipation. It was not a celebration, but it was not quiet either. This was a ritual, a performance of power. The woman would be the center of it. The sacrifice meant to keep fear alive in the hearts of the oppressed, and confidence alive in the hearts of the oppressors. As she was led out, bound, her feet dusty from the walk, the crowd grew restless. Some shouted curses. Some watched in silence. Children clung to their mothers, eyes wide. Men stood stiff, rifles close at hand, as if expecting the entire enslaved population to rise up at any moment. The woman's face was set, whether in calm, despair, or defiance, no one could say. The records of the day tell different stories. To some she looked broken, to others unbent. What is certain is that the town of Natchez saw her final moments not only as punishment, but as warning. A warning written for the enslaved, but also a warning to themselves. Because in her act, they had glimpsed the truth they wished to deny, that no system of chains, no measure of wealth, no whip or gun could fully erase the humanity of those they sought to enslave. That in every quiet glance, in every bowed head, there might still burn a fire waiting to strike. The air was heavy with heat, with dust, with the weight of what was about to unfold. And in that moment, as the woman stood on the edge of death, Natchez itself seemed to hold its breath. The morning of the execution was one that Natchez would not soon forget. The sun rose heavy and hot, the sky a pale sheet above the Mississippi River, and the air thick with dust from wagons rolling into town. The square began to fill before noon, men in coats brushing at the heat with their hats, women in long dresses shading themselves with parasols, children tugging at their mothers' skirts to see what was happening. There was a grim excitement. In the air, the same kind that had marked public hangings for decades. These events were treated as lessons, spectacles, even entertainments. But this one carried something different, deeper shadow. It was not a thief or a murderer standing, accused, not even a runaway slave. It was a woman who had, in the eyes of every planter and family in Natchez, committed the greatest crime possible. She had turned the very tools of servitude, the kitchen, the food, the trust of the household, into weapons. The enslaved population was not allowed to stay behind. Masters made sure they were brought into town, lined up, and forced to watch. The warning had to be seen, felt, burned into their minds. Some stood in silence, their faces blank masks. Others trembled, not from the heat, but from the terror of what they were about to witness. Children clutched the hands of their parents, their eyes wide and searching. The message was clear. This is what happens when one of you dares to raise a hand. Against us, the woman was brought forward under guard, her wrists bound. She walked slowly, her steps steady despite the chains around her ankles. Some in the crowd leaned forward to see her face. Was she frightened? Did she look repentant? Did she look proud? Accounts from the day conflict, as all such records do. Some claimed she held her head high, her eyes cold and unyielding. Others she looked hollow, her gaze far away, as if she had already stepped beyond this world. Whatever the truth, her presence silenced the crowd for a moment. The platform had been built at the center of the square, rough wood standing high so that all could see. The rope hung waiting. Men of the law stood nearby, rifles on their shoulders. The preacher was already there too, his Bible in hand, ready to speak words of salvation, whether or not she wanted them. He tried, perhaps, to offer her a final chance to repent, to speak, to beg forgiveness. She said little, if anything at all. To the white families, her silence was defiance. To the enslaved who watched, it was strength. The executioner stepped forward. The crowd shifted. Some children began to cry, though their mothers hushed them quickly. The air grew hotter, though it was not the sun that made it so heavy, but the weight of what was about to happen. When the moment came, the hush was broken by voices. Some cursed her, calling her devil, witch, murderer. Others shouted prayers, demanding that she seek forgiveness. But above it all, the silence of the enslaved stood firm. They did not shout, did not cry out. They bore witness, their hearts thundering in their chests, knowing that though her body would soon fall, her act had already lived longer than her captors could bear. The rope was placed around her neck. The final words were spoken. And then, with a crack of wood and the shifting of the rope, her body dropped. A gasp went through the crowd, followed by a swell of noise, some cheers, some murmurs, some sobs. Children buried their faces in their mothers' skirts. Men adjusted their hats, their jaws tight. The enslaved stared, their faces still, their thoughts hidden deep within them where no one could pry. For the white families, this was justice. For the enslaved, it was tragedy mixed with something more, a spark of defiance, a reminder that even in death, she had done what so few could ever hope to do. The body was left hanging for a time, the sun beating down, flies already gathering. The crowd did not leave quickly. They lingered, as though needing to stare at her, needing to convince themselves that the danger was gone. Masters made sure their slaves saw every moment, pointing, warning, drilling the lesson in. Never forget. Never try this yourselves. Eventually, the body was cut down. What happened after is not always recorded. Some said she was buried outside consecrated ground, tossed into the earth without ceremony. Others said her remains were burned, erased, as though to wipe away the stain of her defiance. Whatever the truth, the town tried to put her behind them. But the truth of her act could not be buried so easily. In the days that followed, Natchez felt different. On the surface, life returned to its rhythm. The fields still needed tending. The markets still filled with goods. The grand houses still glowed at night with candlelight. But beneath it all ran a current of unease. The masters grew harsher, their suspicion sharper. Food was tasted more carefully. Servants were watched more closely. Whispers of poison spread through kitchens and dining halls. A cough at supper, a stomach ache in the night suddenly, these were not dismissed as easily as before. Fear hung in the air like smoke. The enslaved carried their own burden. They had seen death before, But this was different. They had watched one of their own, a woman who had dared to strike back, be killed in front of them. For some, it was terrifying, a reminder of how absolute the power of the masters was. For others, it was something else, a sign that power could be wounded, that masters could fall, that even one enslaved woman could shake an entire household, even an entire town. Her memory became a kind of secret fire, spoken of in whispers, kept alive in stories told quietly at night. For the white community, her act became a warning, retold again and again. Parents told their children to be wary, to never forget that the people who served them could turn at any moment. Planters wrote letters to one another about tightening discipline, about watching their households more carefully. The story traveled beyond Natchez too, carried by word of mouth, sometimes by small notices in newspapers, always framed as caution. The irony was heavy. In trying to erase her, in trying to make an example of her, they had ensured that her story would not be forgotten. The fear that spread in Natchez was not one that faded quickly. It lived in every suspicious glance, in every harsh punishment, in every tightened grip of control. The woman was gone, but the shadow of what she had done lingered like a ghost in the quarters. Children who had watched the hanging asked their parents questions. Why did she do it? Was she evil, as the white people said? Or was she brave? Parents answered carefully, knowing that any wrong word overheard could bring a whip or worse. Some said she was foolish. Others said she was strong. But deep down, in the hearts of many, there was admiration, an admiration too dangerous to speak. For the town itself, life went on, but the rhythm was different now. The grand houses still stood, the cotton still grew, the river still flowed, with steamboats carrying riches north and south. Yet when families gathered at their long tables for supper, the laughter was quieter, the glances sharper. Every plate of food, every sip of coffee, carried with it the memory of that woman in chains, the one who had used those very meals as her weapon. And so Natchez, for all its wealth and beauty, became a town haunted not by spirits from the grave, but by the living memory of defiance. The horror of what she had done was real, yes, but so too was the horror of what had been done to her, and what continued to be done to thousands like her. That dual truth lingered in the air, heavy, undeniable, impossible to silence. It would be years before the Civil War would break, before slavery would finally be torn apart. But the seed of fear, planted in Natchez that day, in the 1840s, grew quietly in the shadows. And though they tried to erase her name, though they tried to make her nothing more than an example, she remained in the whispers, in the memories, in the unspoken stories passed from one generation to the next. That was the true horror of Natchez. Not only the death of a family by poison, not only the execution of a woman in chains, but the way the town lived on afterward, trying to bury the truth, yet never escaping it. After the execution, Natchez tried to move on, but something had shifted that could not be undone. On the surface, the plantations still thrived. Cotton fields rolled on in waves of white. Steamboats puffed smoke along the Mississippi. Merchants in town still counted their profits by the handful. But under all of that, there was an unease, a restless current that never quieted. For the white families, the story of the enslaved woman became a tale retold with sharp edges. Parents reminded their children not to trust too much, not to grow too comfortable with the people who served them. Masters lectured their households, warning them that loyalty could be a mask, that smiles could hide daggers. Every meal was watched with a new kind of caution. In kitchens, pots were stirred under harsher eyes, food was tasted more carefully, and servants moved beneath the weight of suspicion that never lifted. It was not just in Natchez. Word traveled downriver, upriver, across the South. A brief notice. In a newspaper here, a whispered retelling there. And soon the story of the woman who poisoned her master's family was known far beyond the cotton fields of Mississippi. To planters in Louisiana, Alabama, and Georgia, her act was a warning. They tightened their rules, set harsher punishments, and told themselves that fear was the only thing that kept the system in place. But fear worked both ways. Among the enslaved, her memory lived on in a different form. Not all spoke of her openly, most did not dare, but her story became a shadowed fire, carried in whispers, in the hush of night when work was done and the masters were asleep. To some, she was a figure of tragedy, proof of the cruelty of slavery, a woman who had been pushed beyond her limit until she chose death over submission. To others, she was a symbol of resistance, someone who struck back at the heart of her oppressors, no matter the cost. For children who had seen her die, her memory remained a scar that shaped how they saw the world, proof that slavery was not just a life of labor, but a life always on the edge of terror. The white community tried to turn her into a lesson about obedience, but in the hearts of the enslaved, she became something else entirely, a lesson about defiance. As the years passed, the memory of her act sank into the soil of Natchez, like the roots of the great oaks that shaded the riverbanks. When men rode out to patrol the roads at night, rifles across their saddles, they carried the story with them. When mistresses scolded their servants, when masters gave orders with whips in hand, they did so with the image of her still in their minds. They never admitted it aloud, but she had frightened them more than any runaway, more than any whisper of revolt. She had shown them that rebellion could rise not in the fields with guns or knives, but at their very tables, in their own homes, in the food they placed inside their children's mouths. That was the deepest horror. And so, Natchez became a place haunted not by ghosts of the dead, but by the living memory of what she had done. In the parlors and drawing rooms of the wealthy, her name was spoken like a curse. In the quarters of the enslaved, it was spoken like a prayer. Two worlds lived side by side, each telling her story in a way that suited their fears, their hopes, their truths. Then came the 1850s, when the country itself began to split wider apart. Natchez was still rich, still proud, but it stood on the same crumbling ground as the rest of the South. Whispers of abolition reached even here, carried by riverboats and newspapers, though masters tried to stamp them out. For the enslaved, the tension in the air grew thicker. They could not know the future, could not know that within 2 decades the world of chains would begin to break. But they felt the storm coming, and in that storm, the story of the woman from the 1840s still flickered, a warning, a lesson, a memory. Her act of poison was retold again and again, passed along like a thread tying one generation to the next. Some spoke of her with fear, others with admiration, but no one forgot. When the Civil War finally came and slavery began to collapse, Natchez itself trembled. Soldiers marched through, the great houses filled with worry. The riverboats carried not just cotton, but troops and supplies. And in those years of war, the memory of her act returned once more, stronger than before. For the white families, it was proof of why slavery had been necessary, why they had feared freedom for the people they once owned. For the black men and women who now began to seize freedom for themselves, it was a reminder that resistance had always lived among them, long before armies came to break their chains, even after the war. When slavery ended, but the bitter weight of racism remained, her story did not vanish. It slipped into the oral histories, the tales told among freed families who passed down what they had seen, what they had heard. Children grew up hearing about her, not always in detail, but enough to know that there had once been a woman who had dared to strike back, who had taken her fate into her own hands. Even if it led to her death, the white community tried to erase her, to keep her nameless, to bury her story in shame. But history has a way of clinging to the truth, no matter how hard men try to silence it. And in the cracks of memory, her story survived. Today, when we look back at Natchez in the 1840s, we often see the beauty of the grand houses, the wealth of the cotton empire, the riverboats lined along the Mississippi. But beneath that beauty is a darker history, a history of chains, of silence, of resistance hidden in the shadows. The story of the slave woman who poisoned her master's entire family is one of those truths that forces us to look past the polished image and into the heart of what slavery really was not. It was a world built on cruelty, and cruelty breeds defiance. Her act was terrible, yes, but it was born from a life of terror, a life where choice was stolen until only one choice remained. She reminds us that history is not only about the powerful and the wealthy. It is also about those who were silenced, those who resisted in whatever way they could, even when it meant losing everything. And so Natchez, for all its beauty, carries this story still a horror, a warning, and a memory. The woman may not have left her name written in books, but she left something far more lasting, a mark on the soul of a town, a shadow on the history of a nation, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can refuse to bow. Story ends in death, but it does not end in silence, because Natchez still remembers. And so do we.